It's my pleasure to congratulate Ben Wright on the completion of his dissertation, Publishing the Imitation of Christ, the Distribution Circles of a 15th-Century Bestseller. The Imitation of Christ is really one of the most enduring books in all of human history, written by Thomas of Kempen, a brother of the common life in the 1410s and early 1420s. So here is a book written just 50 years before print really gains momentum. And yet we have something like 800 copies of the work, close to the same number as the Commedia. And yet the Commedia had a century head start on the Imitation. It's one of the very few medieval books that one could still find in a physical bookstore to this day, if we have any physical bookstores. Its popularity endured beyond the Reformation. Through the religious wars of the early modern period in the 17th century, it was more widely published than any other book except for the Bible. And it was read by Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox Christians. It's a spiritual classic. Over the centuries, most of the scholarship in the Imitation has focused on the question of authorship. It was attributed to Gerson for a while, and then to an imaginary abbot named Gersen. And then in the 19th and 20th centuries, attention turned to the manuscripts themselves. But this involved little more than basic description of those manuscripts, which is itself very far from completion, in some cases rudimentary. Here then, we have one of the most widely read books of the medieval period, but a book whose popularity is not immediately obvious. It calls for some explanation. And a work whose popularity has in some ways overshadowed the really important historical questions about its origins and early circulation, the paths that it took to become, as Ben calls it, the runaway bestseller of the 15th century. Ben has done three important things in this dissertation. First, he's explored in a far deeper way than ever before the original context for the Imitation. He shows how this work is the apotheosis of a kind of writing that we see in devout circles, the rapiarium, where writing is figured as tending a garden, collecting spiritual fruit in the form of aphorisms that encourage the reader's spiritual progress. So we can't understand the Imitation without understanding this unique way of reading and writing, one that is rooted in the reading and writing practices of the Brothers of the Common Life. Second, Ben has offered a model for how to understand the circulation of the Imitation. Previous scholarship on the work has listed manuscripts and perhaps identified various kinds of readers of the work, but Ben has gone far beyond this by investigating through dated manuscripts the very earliest readership and the conduits by which this work traveled. Ben has identified through very painstaking work in the manuscripts and in manuscript catalogs and really every available description of any manuscript, the networks of readers or its distribution circles. So he's given us a model for understanding the readership of the work, making sense of a bewildering welter of evidence and turning it into a kind of history, which, after all, in fact, into a kind of story, which is, in fact, what history is, isn't it? The third thing he's done is to show how this work was read, how it contributed to monastic reform, and even how it resonated with humanists. It was my pleasure to work with Ben. I learned a great deal from him. I'm already citing his dissertation in my own scholarship, and I congratulate him warmly on his graduation. I'm sorry we can't celebrate this in person. And I congratulate him on producing a really fine and important dissertation on one of the most important books of the entire medieval period. And that's a really, really fine accomplishment.